Your critic's unpleasant attitude may be a result of consuming a dubious chili dog, not a result of your failure to pick up the living room. 3. Emotional state. When you're really angry, you see the world through a red haze. When you are in love, the glasses change to the rose-colored variety. Depressed screens are tinted blue, and there's a whole genre of music for a soundtrack. If you are what you eat, then you see what you feel. How many times have you seen this on TV? The hero works himself up into a rage, finally tells off his domineering boss or his unfaithful girlfriend, and then stomps out of the room. On the way out he encounters the office boy or the dog, to whom he screams, and that goes for you, too. Big laugh and dissolve to next scene. This happens in real life too, but unfortunately without the painless dissolve to the next scene. Often you take the brunt of anger or rejection that has nothing to do with you. You are as uninvolved as the office boy or the dog. Your only fault was to be unlucky enough to encounter the critic who was still emotional about some earlier experience. Sometimes critics are in a state of general arousal. They're feeling tense or worried or stressed by life in general. Then you cross them in some minor or even imagined way, and they blow up. Their state of arousal is expressed as anger, and their tension is released for a while. For example, your boss chews you out for wasting money. You bought some necessary office supplies and furniture, nothing very extravagant, and you got good prices, too. If your self-esteem is fragile, you might conclude that you lack judgment and that you will never be a success in your job. However, you might learn later that your boss had just received a financial setback and was feeling particularly paranoid about keeping expenses down. There was nothing wrong with your judgment. The blow-up was caused by your boss's free-floating state of arousal, and you became a chance opportunity for release. 4. Habitual behavior patterns. Everyone has coping strategies that have worked in the past and that will probably work in the 155. Self-esteem. Future. These strategies tend to be applied automatically, regardless of the situation. For example, a child of violent parents may learn to avoid notice by not speaking up, by hiding needs, and by trying to anticipate what others want without actually asking them. These strategies will be carried over into adulthood, where they will not work very well for achieving a satisfying relationship with another adult. Another example would be a woman who grew up in a family where an ironic, sarcastic style of humor was the norm. Outside her family circle, she often turns people off. Her habitual behavior pattern of satirizing and parodying those around her is taken as a critical, negative attitude. Often when you feel criticized or slighted by someone, you find out later from the critic's friends that he's always like that. What they mean is that his habitual behavior patterns lead him to be critical or negative with some kinds of people in some situations, regardless of the objective reality at the time. Everyone drags an enormous baggage of old behavior patterns around all the time. More often than not, people are reaching into their bag of tricks for a familiar way of reacting, instead of basing their reaction on a fresh, accurate assessment of the situation and your role in it. They are watching old tapes on their screen instead of concentrating on the live action reported by their senses. 5. Beliefs. Values, prejudices, interpretations, theories, and specific conclusions about an ongoing interaction can all influence what people see on their screens. People who value neatness may exaggerate all the sloppiness they see in the world. Those who are prejudiced against blacks or Jews or Southerners cannot trust what they see on their screens concerning the groups they hate. If a man believes strongly in independence, he will tend to interpret cooperation as weakness. If a woman has a theory that all traumatic weaning causes weight problems in later life, then she will see obese people in light of her theory, not in the clear light of objective reality. If you lean back in your chair and cross your arms while talking to an insurance salesman, he may interpret that gesture as resistance to his sales pitch and redouble his efforts. His view of you on his screen will be determined by this interpretation, right or wrong. You may have leaned back because your muscles are stiff or because you wanted to get a view of the clock. Beliefs are tied very strongly to past experience of what life is like, what works, what hurts, and what helps. The bank officer who rejects your loan application is probably not rejecting you personally. She is responding to her past experiences of people in similar 156. Responding to criticism. Financial situations who either did or didn't pay back their loans. The same goes for the woman who turns you down for a date. She is very likely operating out of her beliefs based on experience. She may believe that tall men are not for her, or that she must never date a Pisces, or that she must not get serious with anyone over a certain age. She is rejecting who she believes you are, not who you really are. The real you isn't on her screen at all. 6. Needs. Everybody you meet is trying to get needs met all the time. This imperative affects what people see on their screens. A hungry man has a keen eye for food on the table, but might not notice a roaring fire in the fireplace or the magazines on the coffee table. A cold woman entering the room will go straight for the fire and not notice the food or the magazines. A bored person waiting in the room would seize immediately on the magazines as a source of diversion. A thirsty person would find nothing in the room to satisfy that need and hold a lower opinion of the surroundings than the other three. Emotional needs work the same way to distort screens and bring on criticism that has nothing to do with the actual situation. A man who wants to impress his date in a restaurant might be quite critical about the food and complain about the service, when in fact both are excellent. A less obvious case is that of the guy who is quite belligerent about asking you for your help because he has a strong need to be in control of every situation. Another subtle example is an acquaintance who is often very catty about other people's appearance as a result of her own need to be constantly reassured about her own physical attractiveness. Criticism that is out of proportion to the occasion is often motivated by some hidden agenda. The critic shames you into doing something that you wouldn't do if you knew the real reason behind it. For example, let's say that your boss asks you to stay overtime or work on the weekend and then becomes very critical when you turn him down. His request and reaction make no sense to you. There just isn't enough work to do to justify the inconvenience. The real situation may be that your boss is just trying to impress his boss by saying that he had staff in over the weekend. Or that he needs you there to receive an important phone call and he's too lazy to come in and wait for it himself. There could be several hidden agendas, none of them having anything to do with your job or your performance. Sometimes critics are fully aware of the emotional needs or hidden agendas that motivate them, and sometimes they're not. But since you're the person on the receiving end of the criticism, their awareness doesn't matter to you. All that matters to you is 157. Self-esteem. Recognizing that needs distort a critic's perception of reality, and therefore no criticism can be taken at face value. Exercise. Go around for the rest of the day or all day tomorrow imagining that your eyes are a camera. Your ears are microphones. Be the director of a documentary. Consciously compose a voiceover commentary on what you see and hear. Shift your attention to emphasize the negative or positive aspects of a scene. When someone says something to you, pretend that both of you are characters in a soap opera. Imagine several possible responses besides the one you would normally give. Imagine several possible motivations for what other people do besides the motives you assume are correct. Notice how this distancing exercise changes your awareness of reality. It should make you realize that there are many more possible ways to see reality than the one you usually use. It should also point out how automatic and limited your usual perception of the world is. The screen is Monster Maker. The illustration on the next page shows a simple, everyday encounter. The reality is simple and blameless. Two men meet at a party. The man in glasses asks the newcomer what he does for a living, trying to make conversation and put him at ease. The newcomer is here with his wife. These are his wife's friends, not his. He'd rather be at home watching the ball game or drinking beer with his buddies. He hates this sort of party and didn't want to come in the first place. He thinks most of his wife's friends from work are stuck-up wimps who don't know how to have a good time. All this background and his current arousal level affect what he sees on his screen, and he responds to the distorted image with a thinly veiled insult. Inputs. Reality. Short guy with glasses, tie, asks, so, what do you do? Plus innate constitution. Warning, new encounter, be careful, expect. Attack. Plus physiological state, short of breath from running upstairs. Sweaty, heart rate high. Plus emotional state, aroused, irritated at being late, angry at wife. For making me come. Plus habitual behavior pattern, take the psychological high ground, get in the first blow and establish dominance. 158. Responding to criticism. Plus beliefs, here's another intellectual twerp in glasses and a tie. These stuck-up eggheads are always looking for a chance to put a working man down. Plus needs, to relieve tension of anger and anxiety, to appear powerful, tough, competent. Equals response, loud, chest out, leaning forward into the twerp's face, I work for a living. What do you do? Mantra for handling criticism. The moment you hear a critical remark, ask yourself, what's on this person's screen? Immediately assume that there is at best a tenuous, indirect connection to reality. You will stand a far greater chance of being right than if you assume that all critical remarks arise from some shortcoming in yourself. Remember that people can only criticize what's on their screens and that their screens are not reliable. It's very unlikely that any criticism is based on an accurate perception of you. It's much more likely that the critic is reacting to emotions, memories, and behavior patterns that have almost nothing to do with you. Thinking poorly about yourself because of such criticism is a mistake. It's like running. 159. Self-esteem. Scared from a little kid with a sheet over his head who pops out behind a bush and says, boo. You may be startled at first and pull back, but then you laugh and think, it's okay, it's nothing real. Just. So with criticism. You may feel briefly taken aback when someone criticizes you, but then you smile and say to yourself, boy, I wonder what's on his screen to make him so critical of me. Responding to criticism. Does all this seem a little unrealistic? Do you find yourself saying, wait a minute, some criticism is based on facts. Sometimes the critic is right on the money, and you have to acknowledge it. Or sometimes you need to defend yourself. You can't just secretly smile and keep mum. If this is what you're thinking, you're right. Often you have to respond in some way to criticism. The mantra, what's on his screen, is just a brief, but essential, bit of first aid for yourself. Esteem. Remember that all criticism shares one characteristic. It is unwelcome. You didn't invite people to dump the distorted contents of their screen on you. You may feel that you owe some critics a response, but you never owe a critic your self-esteem. Ineffective response styles. There are 3 basic ways to go wrong in responding to criticism: being aggressive, being passive, or both. 1. Aggressive style. The aggressive response to criticism is to counterattack. Your wife criticizes your TV viewing habits, and you counter with a cutting remark about her affection for soap operas. Your husband makes a snide remark about your weight, and you counterattack by mentioning his blood pressure. This is the, oh yeah, theory of how to handle criticism. Every critic is met with a hostile, oh yeah, attitude, and a response that varies in intensity from, how dare you even think of criticizing me? To, well, I may not be much, but neither are you. The aggressive style of responding to criticism has one advantage: you usually get people off your back right away. But this is a short-term benefit. If you have to deal again and again with the same people, they will come back at you with bigger and bigger guns. Their attacks and your counterattacks will escalate into all-out war. You will turn potentially constructive critics into destructive enemies. Even if your aggressive counterattack succeeds in shutting a critic up for good, you have not necessarily won. If people have 160. Responding to criticism. Genuine grievances with you, they may go behind your back and use indirect means to get what they want from you. You will be the last to know what is going on. Consistently responding to criticism aggressively is a symptom of low self-esteem. You lash out at critics because you secretly share their low opinion of you and violently resist any reminder of your shortcomings. You attack your critics to bring them down to your own level, to show that although you may not be very worthy, you are more worthy than they are. Consistently counterattacking your critics is also a guarantee that your self-esteem will remain low. The process of attack, counterattack, and escalation means that you will soon be surrounded by critics who besiege you with evidence of your worthlessness. Even if you had some self-esteem to start with, it will be battered down in time. Furthermore, your bellicose style of relating to people who are even slightly critical of you will prevent you from forming any deep relationships. 2. Passive style. The passive style of responding to criticism is to agree, to apologize, and to surrender at the first sign of an attack. Your wife complains that you are getting a little overweight, and you Cave in. Yes, I know. I'm just becoming a fat slob. I don't know how. You can stand to look at me. Your husband tells you you're following the car ahead of you too closely, and you immediately say that you're sorry, slow down, and promise never to do it again. Silence can also be a passive response to criticism. You make no response to criticism that deserves a response. Your critic then continues to harass you until you provide some belated verbal reaction, usually an apology. There are two possible advantages to the passive style of responding to criticism. First, some critics will leave you alone when they find that they arouse no fight in you. It's not enough sport for them. Second, if you don't make any response at all, it saves you the trouble of thinking up something to say. Both these advantages are short-term ones. In the long term, you will find that many critics enjoy shooting fish in a barrel. They will return time and again to take potshots at you, just because they know that they can get an apology or an agreement. Your response lets them feel superior, and they don't care whether it's sporting at all. And even though you're saved the trouble of thinking up a verbal response, you'll still find that you are expending a lot of mental energy in thinking up purely mental retorts. You don't say them, but you think them. 161. Self-esteem. The real disadvantage of the passive style is that surrendering to others' negative opinions of you is deadly to your self-esteem. 3. Passive-aggressive style. This style of responding to criticism combines some of the worst aspects of both the aggressive and the passive styles. When you are first criticized, you respond passively by apologizing or agreeing to change. Later you get even with your critic by forgetting something, failing to make the promised change, or some other covertly aggressive action. For example, a man criticized his wife for not clearing out an accumulation of magazines and paperbacks. She promised to box them up for the Goodwill truck. After being reminded twice to do it, she actually did call the Goodwill and make the donation. While she was at it, she culled some old clothes from the closet, including a favorite old shirt of her husband's. When he got angry about her giving his favorite shirt away, she apologized again, saying that she didn't realize that it was so important to him, and if he was so fussy he could call Goodwill and handle it himself next time. In this example, the woman was unconscious of any plot to get even. Passive aggression is often unconscious. You make understandable mistakes. Your intentions are good, but somehow you screw up one little detail. You prepare a special dinner to make amends with your girlfriend, but you forget that she hates cream sauces. You are late for an important date or buy the wrong size or put a dent in the car. Passive aggression lowers your self-esteem twice. Your self-esteem suffers first because you have agreed with someone about your shortcomings. Then your self-esteem gets taken down another peg when you covertly strike back. You secretly hate yourself, either for being sneaky if you're conscious of the counterattack or for being fallible if the retaliation takes the form of an unconscious mistake. A consistently passive-aggressive response style is hard to change because it's indirect. The vicious circle of criticism apology aggression is a covert guerrilla war fought deep in the underbrush. It's very hard to break out of the circle and achieve a level of honest, straightforward communication. The passive-aggressive person ends up too scared to risk open confrontation, and the other person has had all trust and confidence destroyed by repeated acts of sabotage. Effective response styles. The effective way to respond to criticism is to use the assertive style. The assertive style of responding to criticism doesn't attack, surrender to, or sabotage the critic. It disarms the critic. When you respond assertively to a critic, you clear up misunderstandings. 162. Responding to criticism. Acknowledge what you consider accurate about the criticism, ignore the rest, and put an end to the unwelcome attack without sacrificing your self-esteem. There are 3 techniques for responding assertively to criticism: acknowledgement, clouding, and probing. Acknowledgement. Acknowledgement means simply agreeing with a critic. Its purpose is to stop criticism immediately, and it works very well. When you acknowledge criticism, you say to the critic, yes, one have the same picture on my screen. We are watching the same channel. When someone criticizes you, and the criticism is accurate, just follow these 4 simple steps. 1. Say, you're right. 2. Paraphrase the criticism so that the critic is sure you heard him or her correctly. 3. Thank the critic, if appropriate. 4. Explain yourself, if appropriate. Note that an explanation is not an apology. While you are working on raising your self-esteem, the best policy is never to apologize and seldom explain. While you are working on raising your self-esteem, the best policy is never to apologize and seldom explain. Remember that criticism is uninvited and unwelcome. Most critics don't deserve either an apology or an explanation. They will have to be satisfied with being told they're right. Here's an example of responding to criticism with a simple acknowledgement. Criticism: 1. Wish you'd be more careful with your things. I found your hammer lying in the wet grass. Response: you're right, I should have put that hammer away when I was through using it. Thanks for finding it. This is all that needs to be said. No explanation or apology or pledge to reform is needed. The respondent acknowledges a minor lapse, thanks the critic, and the case is closed. Here is another example of simple acknowledgement. Criticism: 1. Almost ran out of gas on the way to work this morning. Why didn't you fill the tank yesterday? I don't see why I always have to be the one who does it. Response: you're right, I noticed we were low on gas and I should have got some. I'm really sorry. 163. Self-esteem. In this example, the respondent has caused the critic some real inconvenience and adds a sincere apology. Here's another example of a case where some explanation is in order. Criticism: it's 9:30. You should have been here half an hour ago. Response: you're right, I'm late. The bus I was on this morning broke down and they had to send out another one to pick us all up. Advanced acknowledgement involves turning a critic into an ally. Here's an example. Criticism: your office is a mess. How do you ever find anything in here? Response: you're right, my office is a mess, and I can never find what I want. How do you think I could reorganize my filing system? Exercise. After each of the following criticisms, write your own response using the full, you're right, paraphrase, explain, formula. Criticism. This is the sloppiest report I've ever seen. What did you do? Write it in your sleep. Response. Criticism. Your dog dug a giant hole under our fence. Why can't you keep it under control? Response. Criticism. When are you going to return those books to the library? I'm sick of asking you. You've promised to do it twice now, and they're still sitting on the hall table. Response. Acknowledgement has several advantages. It is always the best strategy for quick and effective deflation of critics. Critics need your resistance in order to keep hassling you. They want to fully develop a theme, hitting you time after time with examples and restatements of your failings. When you agree with a critic, you go with the force of the blow, as in judo. The criticism is harmlessly expended on empty air. The critic is left with nothing more to say, since your refusal to argue has made further talk unnecessary. Very few critics will persist after acknowledgement. They get the satisfaction of being right, and that is worth being denied the luxury of raking you over the coals of length. Acknowledgement has one big disadvantage. It doesn't protect your self-esteem if you acknowledge something that isn't true about yourself. Acknowledgement only works to protect your self-esteem. 164. Responding to criticism. When you can sincerely agree with what a critic is saying. When you can't agree fully, you are better off using the clouding technique. Clouding. Clouding involves a token agreement with a critic. It is used when criticism is neither constructive nor accurate. When you use clouding to deal with criticism, you are saying to the critic, yes, some of what is on your screen is also on my screen. But to yourself you add, and some isn't. You cloud by agreeing in part, in probability, or in principle. 1. Agreeing in part. When you agree in part, you find just one part of what a critic is saying, and acknowledge that part. Here is an example. Criticism. You're not reliable. You forget to pick up the kids, you let the bills pile up until we could lose the roof over our head, and I can't ever count on you to be there when I need you. Response. You're certainly right that I did forget to pick up the kids last week after their swimming lesson. In this example, the blanket statement, you're unreliable, is too global to agree to. The charge that they will lose the roof over their heads is an exaggeration, and the, I can't ever count on you, just isn't true. So the respondent picks one factual statement about not picking up the kids and acknowledges that. Here's another example of clouding by agreeing in part. Criticism. Miss, this is the worst coffee I've ever had. It's weak and watery and barely warm. I heard good things about this place. I hope the food is better than the coffee. Response. Oh, you're right, it's cold. I'll get you another cup from a fresh pot right away. In this example, the waitress finds one objective truth that she can agree with and ignores the other complaints. 2. Agreeing in probability. You agree in probability by saying, it's possible you're right. Even though the chances may, in your mind, be 1,000,000 to 1 against it, you can still honestly say that, it's possible. Here are a couple of examples. Criticism. If you don't floss your teeth, you'll get gum disease and be sorry for the rest of your life. Response. You may be right. I could get gum disease. Criticism. Riding the clutch like that is terrible for the transmission. You'll need an overhaul twice as quick. You should just let it out and leave it alone. Response. Yes, I may be doing the wrong thing here. 165. Self-esteem. These examples show the essence of clouding. You are appearing to agree, and the critic can be satisfied with that. But the unspoken, self-esteem preserving message is, although you may be right, I don't really think that you are. I intend to exercise my right to my own opinion, and I'll continue to do just as I damn well please. 3. Agreeing in principle. This clouding technique acknowledges a critic's logic without necessarily endorsing all of a critic's assumptions. It uses a conditional, if, then, format. Criticism. That's the wrong tool for the job. A chisel like that will slip and mess up the wood. You ought to have a gouge instead. Response. You're right, if the chisel slips it will really mess up the wood. The respondent is admitting the logical connection between tool slipping and damage to the work, but has not actually agreed that the chisel is the wrong tool. Here's another example. Criticism. You're really taking a chance by claiming all these deductions you don't have receipts for. The IRS is really cracking down. You're just asking for an audit. It's stupid to try to save a few bucks and bring them down on you like a pack of bloodhounds. Response. You're right, if I take the deductions, I'll be attracting more attention to myself. And if I get audited, it will be a real hassle. This response agrees with the critic's logic without agreeing with the critic's assessment of the degree of risk. Exercise. In the space after the following 3 critical statements, write your own responses. To each criticism, agree in part, in probability, and in principle. Criticism. Your hair is a fright. It's dry and fly away, and it must be a month since you had it cut. I hope you're not going out in public like that. If you do, people will be laughing behind your back. How can you expect people to take you seriously when you present yourself to the world like that? Agree in part. Agree in probability. Agree in principle. Criticism. You spend all your money on appearances, your clothes, your apartment, your car. How things look is all that. 166. Responding to criticism. Matters to you, keeping up a good front. How do you expect to handle any emergencies if you never save anything? Suppose you got sick, suppose you lost your job. It just makes me sick seeing you squandering every dime you make. Agree in part. Agree in probability. Agree in principle. Criticism. Is this the best you can do? I wanted an in-depth analysis, and this just hits the high points. This report should be twice as long, with discussion of all the points I raised in my memo. If we turn this into the planning department, they'll just toss it back. You need to try it again, and put a little thought into it. Agree in part. Agree in probability. Agree in principle. The advantage of clouding in its various forms is that it quiets critics without sacrificing your self-esteem. The critics hear the magic message, you're right, and are satisfied with that. They don't notice or don't care that you have said that they are only partly right, probably right, or right in principle. Sometimes it's hard to content yourself with a clouding response. You may feel compelled to give voice to your real, fully developed opinions and feelings on the subject. It's tempting to argue and attempt to win the critic over to your point of view. This is all right, if the criticism is constructive and the critic is amenable to a change of viewpoint. But most criticism with which you disagree isn't worth dignifying with an argument. You and your self-esteem are better off clouding the issue with a token agreement and then changing the subject. You may feel guilty when you first try clouding. It may seem sneaky and manipulative. If that's the case, remember that you don't owe anything to a critic. Criticism is unwelcome and uninvited. Criticism is often a sign of critics, basic negativity and insecurity. They have to harp on what's wrong with life instead of enjoying that. 167. Self-esteem. Positive side. They have to tear you down in order to bolster themselves up. Most critics are manipulative themselves. Rather than directly ask you to do something, they try to influence you indirectly by complaining about you. Especially when criticism is incorrect or not constructive, you are perfectly within your rights to be just as manipulative as the critic. Your self-esteem comes first. The only disadvantage of clouding is that you may use the technique too soon. If you don't understand the critic's motives or message fully and you use clouding to cut the exchange short, you may miss hearing something beneficial. Before jumping in with your clouding response, they have to tear you down in order to bolster. It may seem sneaky and manipulative. If that's the case, remember that you don't owe anything to a critic. Criticism is unwelcome and uninvited. Criticism is often a sign of critics, basic negativity and insecurity. They have to harp on what's wrong with life instead of enjoying that. 167. Self-esteem. Positive side. They have to tear you down in order to bolster themselves up. Most critics are manipulative themselves. Rather than directly ask you to do something, they try to influence you indirectly by complaining about you. Especially when criticism is incorrect or not constructive, you are perfectly within your rights to be just as manipulative as the critic. Your self-esteem comes first. The only disadvantage of clouding is that you may use the technique too soon. If you don't understand the critic's motives or message fully and you use clouding to cut the exchange short, you may miss hearing something beneficial. Before jumping in with your clouding response, make sure that you understand what is being said and determine if the critic is trying to be constructive. If you can't tell exactly what the critic means, use probing. Probing. A lot of criticism is vague. You can't tell what the critic is driving at. You must use probing to clarify the critic's intent and meaning. When you have uncovered the full message, then you can decide if it is constructive, if you agree with all or part of it, and how you will respond. By probing, you are saying to your critic, your screen's not clear to me. Could you adjust the focus, please? You keep asking the critic to clarify until you have a good picture. Then you can say, oh, yes, I have the same channel on my screen, or, well, yes, some of what you have on your screen is also on mine and some isn't. Keywords for probing are, exactly, specifically, and, for example. Here are some typical probes. How exactly have I let you down? What specifically bothers you about the way I do the dishes? Can you give me an example of my carelessness? Oh yeah, prove it. And, says who, are not examples of proper probing. You should keep your tone inquisitive and non-argumentative. You want further information, not a fight. When you are probing a nagger, it's helpful to keep asking the nagger for examples of the behavior change he or she wants you to make. Insist that the complaint be put in the form of a request for a change in your behavior. Let your critic away from abstract and pejorative terms such as lazy, inconsiderate, sloppy, grouchy, and so on. Here is an example of probing a nagger. 77. He, you're lazy. She, lazy how, exactly? He, you just sit around. She, what do you want me to do? He, stop being such a slug. She, no, really, I want to know what you'd like me to do. 168. Responding to criticism. He, well, clean out the basement, for one thing. She, and what else? He, stop staring at the tube all day. She, no, that's what you don't want me to do. What actual things do you want me to do instead? This approach forces the nagger away from name-calling and vague complaining towards some real requests that you can seriously consider. It directs the focus away from a recitation of past sins and toward the future, where the possibility of change exists. Exercise. After each of the following 3 vague criticisms, write your own probing responses. Criticism, you're not pulling your weight around here. Probe. Criticism, you're so cold and distant tonight. Probe. Criticism, why do you have to be so stubborn? Why can't you give a little? Probe. The advantages of probing are obvious. You get the information you need to figure out how to respond to a critic. You may find out that what sounded like criticism at first was actually a reasonable suggestion, an expression of concern, or a cry for help. At its best, clarifying your critic's message can turn a casual complaint into a meaningful dialogue. At worst, probing a critic will confirm your suspicion that he or she is maliciously attacking you and therefore deserves your most adroit clouding tactics. The only disadvantage of probing is that it is an interim tactic. It just clears up your understanding of the critic's intent and meaning. You still have to choose whether to acknowledge the criticism or to use one of the forms of clouding. The decision tree in the next section will help you review which responses to make based on your probing. Putting it all together. The first part of this chapter taught you what to do the moment you first suspect that you are hearing something critical. Apply your mantra, what's on the screen. Remind yourself that the critic is only being critical of the content of his or her screen, not of reality. It has nothing to do with you directly. Resist the automatic agreement. 169. Self-esteem. Of your own internal pathological critic. Tell yourself to take your self-esteem out of the circuit. Once you have your self-esteem out of the circuit, you can concentrate on what the critic is actually saying. Listen first for the critic's intention. Hear the tone. Consider the situation and your relationship to the critic. Is the criticism constructive? Is the critic trying to help or hassle? Look at the decision tree below. It shows all the possible appropriate, assertive, high self-esteem responses you can make to any criticism. If you can't tell whether the critic means to help or hassle you, you need to use probing until the intention becomes clear. Once you have determined the intention, you ask yourself if the content of the message is accurate. Do you agree with it? If you find that criticism is meant to be constructive, but is simply inaccurate, all you have to do is point out the critic's error. And the case is closed. If constructive criticism is accurate, all you have to do is acknowledge it, and again the case is closed. The same goes for criticism that is not constructive, but happens to be completely accurate. You just agree with it and spike the critic's guns. The only case that is left is the one in which the critic is not constructive and not accurate. This critic not only is out to hassle you, but he or she has also got the facts wrong. This critic deserves a clouding response. Agree in part, in probability, or in principle, and stop there. Exercise. Use some example of criticism from this chapter or from your own life. Run them through the decision tree and see how you would respond, depending on what is constructive and what is accurate. 170. Responding to criticism. Remove self-esteem from circuit. A. What is the critic saying? Is it constructive? Yes, no, I don't know. Why? Is it accurate? Is it accurate? Probe. No, yes, no. Correct. Ms. Acknowledge cloud conception. Stop. 171-10. Asking for what you want. The inability to ask others for what you want is a classic symptom of low self-esteem. It stems from your basic feeling of unworthiness. You feel that you don't deserve to get what you want. Your wants don't seem legitimate or important. Other people's wants seem much more valid and pressing than your own. You go around asking other people what they want and trying to get it for them. You may be so afraid of rejection or so out of touch with your needs that you aren't even aware of what you want. You can't afford the risk of consciously wanting something from others. For example, you may fantasize about a certain kind of lovemaking that particularly appeals to you, but never experience it because you never ask for it. In fact, you never even consciously admit to yourself that you want it. It's just a fantasy. You don't acknowledge your want because if you did, you might actually ask for it. And if you ask for it, you might be rejected as too kinky. Or your sexual partner might take your request as an implication that you find your sex life together inadequate. This chapter will list and explain your legitimate needs, discuss the relationship between needs and wants, teach you how to raise your awareness of your wants, provide exercises to analyze and precisely define what you want, and give training and practice in asking for what you want. Self-esteem. Your legitimate needs. What follows is a list of legitimate needs, the environmental conditions, activities, and experiences important for physical and psychological health. The purpose of this list is to stimulate your thinking about the importance and variety of human needs. You may think that some of the needs don't apply to you, that some of them are redundant, that there are needs omitted, or that the list is not categorized properly. That's fine. In fact, feel free to add to, subtract from, combine, and reorganize the needs on this list. Doing so will be an excellent way to begin thinking about your own personal needs.